good morning. We are going to be talking today about the process of both addiction and recovery, and have a kind of global picture of what causes a person to get into that downward spiral of addiction and what helps a person come into the upward spiral of recovery. They're parallel processes. So first of all, our first slide's talking about all the different aspects that when we look at addiction, we look at the biological aspects, the psychological aspects, the social aspects, and the spiritual aspects. Today's lecture is predominantly going to focus on the biological aspects. Okay, this is just a fun saying that I can definitely relate to. In the 60s, people took acid to make the world weird. Now the world is weird, and people take Prozac to make it seem normal. Part of what we know in our culture and our society today is that we are always trying to alter our experience with life. And we are a very pharmaceutically oriented culture. If you look at television ads very often, you know that a huge proportion of those are definitely ads requiring you to think about using this drug, whatever the drug might be. So we have drugs for every age group, and we're constantly advertising those. So we do take Prozac today to make our world seem normal. Okay, what I want to do is kind of do a real quick overview of the various drug categories. I think this isn't going to be anything new to you. You already know this. But drugs that depress our alertness are depressants. That's a drug category. And that would include drugs that relieve anxiety and drugs that are prescription sleeping pills. So it's all on a continuum. These drugs are sometimes referred to as sedative hypnotics, and they have very similar actions in the brain. Depressants, if you click the next slide, is basically alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. Many people do not consider alcohol to be a depressant because when they drink, they get wired. They get more alert, more aggressive, more involved, more social. And so how could that drug be a depressant? Well, it's a depressant because one of the functions it has is to depress the judgment and the inhibition parts of our brain. So if a person is anxious and they drink, that can depress that anxiety and allow you to feel more social. So part of the confusion around alcohol is it seems sometimes like a stimulant, but in reality it is a depressant. And so when we are doing our drug presentations, we're going to be looking at alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. I just hit this. The exact opposite of that is stimulants. So we have depressants that depress our central nervous system, and we have stimulants that amp up our central nervous system. And that would include drugs that give that fight or flight kind of reaction that we have. Stimulants are often the most commonly used drugs in our society and can be lethal. Next slide. So we have cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, and xanthines. Most people don't think of that term, don't know that term, xanthines, but that's coffee, tea, and chocolate, because there's a stimulating property in those drugs as well. Most of us today in our society are well aware of the stimulant properties, particularly of methamphetamine, because it was such a drug that overtook, particularly in the West. So, next slide. Nicotine is a very interesting drug, and it's kind of in its own separate category because it has some stimulating aspects and some depressing aspects. It affects many different neurotransmitters. And we know, in fact, that cigarette smokers have both tolerance and dependence with nicotine. In fact, I'm here to tell you, and it could show up in a question at some point on an exam, our worst drug, our very worst drug in our society is nicotine. Nicotine kills over 400,000 people a year. And if you were to add in all of the deaths from heroin overdoses and meth experiences and on and on and on, they would maybe total this, where nicotine totals this. So nicotine is our worst drug in this society in terms of death. I don't think most people think of that. We think we want to make, you know, meth the horror drug and all those other kinds of drugs that get a lot of attention in society. But it is truly nicotine that is our worst drug for death. Cannabis. This is also in a category by itself, and it is sometimes in a lot of the society in terms of controversy. In fact, a lot of us have had lots of discussion around the medical use. In fact, in our state recently, it's a huge issue within the treatment centers. Treatment centers are struggling with what to do with people who have a medical card for marijuana use. Physical dependence is rare, but many, 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 many people become psychologically dependent on marijuana. And again, this is a drug that gets minimized in our society. People think, oh, it's just pot, it's innocent. It's not as heavy as heroin. It's not as dangerous as methamphetamine. But in fact, it is a very serious drug because it is also one of the major drugs that teenagers will use early on in their use. And so we know that Marinol is the prescription form that was allowed for a long time, and there are different forms of marijuana. Okay? Hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are one of those drug categories that were extremely popular back in the 60s and 70s, and the use has often gone down. In fact, it's gone down dramatically since those times. But it can increase depending on the different subcultures that you're looking at. One of the things that's really interesting about this drug category is that it's often been used for both religious and mystical purposes as well. And in fact, peyote is a legal drug for the Native American population to use in their religious ceremonies. So this drug it's called hallucinogens, but it often doesn't have hallucinations except at higher doses. It's more of a sensory change that happens for people, where people experience the sight of sound or feel color. And so there is a blending, a blurring of senses. Okay? And so we have the big one is LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and so on and so forth. Many drugs will have hallucinogenic properties. Okay? And then finally, narcotics, which are also opiates. The word narcotic is misleading at times because in the early days of the drug regulations in the early 1900s, cocaine was considered a narcotic. So that word gets kind of confusing for people. We're better off talking about opiates. And we all know that opiates have been used for centuries, both as medicine and for psychoactive properties. And in the US, we do have heroin that is prohibited, but some other countries use heroin for other kinds of issues for medical purposes. And it's interesting to note that most of our sense of addiction in the general population, most of our sense of addiction comes from our understanding of opiates, because we've all seen the movies where the person is going through opiate withdrawal and we say, oh yes, that person is addicted. So narcotics and opiates create a physical dependence, but that has caused us to have not the best thinking around addiction, because people have therefore minimized psychological addiction, thinking, well, at least, you know, you're not going to go through those wild withdrawals that you do with a narcotic or an opiate. So it is clearly both psychologically and physically depending. It causes people to become dependent. So there we go. Opium, cocaine, or excuse me, codeine, morphine, and heroin. Okay. So back to our very first slide. Doesn't matter what the drug is that we're talking about. All drugs have to be treated, all people who are drug dependent have to be treated on a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual fashion. Okay? So that goes back to that. We treat the whole person within a social context. So treating the whole person, every aspect of that person, and doing it within the social network that they live in. I love this slide. Many of you have seen this on a variety of things that are passed around the internet. And it, of course, is an iceberg. And we all know with icebergs that what you see above the water is only about 10% of the true iceberg. And I use this slide to talk about the fact that in addiction treatment, what we know is what we can see, this 10%. What we don't know about how to effectively treat people is this 90%. And we all are aware that sometimes the recovery rate for people and survival rate, recovery and survival rate for people with addiction is not what we would like it to be. It is tragically not what we would like it to be. And so as we understand more about how every individual person's body works, as we understand more how everybody's individual healing from trauma will happen best, we'll have better recovery rates. We're already moving in that direction. But you know, when you think back on any other disease that we've had, let's take cancer for example. The way we treat cancer today, I'm sure, will not be how we'll treat cancer 50 years from now. And 50 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, my gosh, can you believe that they did that? But it's the best we have right now. And so I'm always encouraging my students to keep a very open mind. What you know is treatment today is going to evolve and should evolve, just as cancer treatment should evolve. So don't get caught in, well, this is how I went through treatment, this is what I know treatment to be, this is how treatment should be, it worked for me. We have to be much more broad and open in understanding this whole field is evolving dramatically. And as you go through your program, you're going to be challenged on some of the ways that maybe you know about treatment. We're going to encourage you to be much more open, for example, to the use of medications. Let me just kind of do a little side note here. We said earlier on that nicotine was our worst drug. And I think, if again we're talking death rates, our worst drug. For some reason, most people have an openness to understanding that somebody might need to take a medication to help them get to abstinence, right? We know about patches. We know about pills that people can take to help them get to abstinence. And we seem to be okay with that. In fact, if you have a loved one or you yourself have been struggling with the whole addiction to nicotine, you might have tried some of these methods. And there's probably 8 different methods that somebody can use today to help them get to recovery. And in fact, we call these abstinence enhancers. Okay, abstinence enhancers. We know that the ultimate goal is abstinence. But for many people, deep in the throes of their addiction, it's not as easy as today I stop. It has to be a process where they have support. And some of that support traditionally, and rightfully so, has been other people through 12-step meetings, through perhaps a church involvement, through a close friend or a loved one helping you through that time of trying to reach abstinence. But what we're looking at is that there are medications now that can help a person get to abstinence just like we do with nicotine dependence. We are okay in allowing people to use patches, to use medication. Zyban is a medication. Chantix was a medication that was being used until there were some problems being discovered. But these drugs allow the person to get to abstinence in a more healthy way rather than just that cold turkey option. And so one of the ways that I want you to keep your mind open is that whether the drug is a stimulant, a depressant, a hallucinogen, an opiate, whatever it is, there's good research going on now to how can we help a person normalize their nervous system enough that they can get to abstinence. So we'll be talking about those in your program, particularly when you get to physiological actions. The course that I teach, we go through each one of the drug categories and look at some of the medications that are being used to help a person get to abstinence. Okay, this woman, Alice Miller, is a person who is very well known in the psychological circles. And she has done great research in looking at the childhood events of various people. I know she wrote about Adolf Hitler and what was his childhood like and how did that help him develop into the person he was. So this is her statement about addictions. Struggling with addictions is one of the ways to avoid the confrontation with our own history. It is striking to see how often a sexual addiction ceases when the patient begins to experience his own feelings and can recognize his own true needs. This is very strongly a statement about one type of addiction, sexual addiction, but it would hold true whether the person is alcohol addicted, heroin addicted, methamphetamine addicted, that an addiction helps us divorce ourselves from our own feelings and emotions. And I always say that's not necessarily a bad thing initially. That's the important point, initially. For example, many of us know, some of you have had this experience of being in treatment, and you have to write a goodbye letter to your drug of choice. Let's say it was alcohol. And those letters are extremely powerful. And a person will often start out saying, "Thank you for being there for me when I needed you. I had nothing else in my life to go to. And my life was so hard, with so much trauma in it, that you helped me survive. I might not have survived if you had not been there for me. However, our relationship changed, and now you're killing me. And it is time to say goodbye to you." And so the person goes on to say their goodbyes to their substance of abuse. When you think about the statistic that 80% of women who become dependent on a substance were sexually abused, that makes sense, doesn't it? So often in our culture, we don't have anyone that's safe and healthy for us to go to. And tragically, the only thing that does help some people survive is a substance, because there's no one in their world that they can go to help them cope with this intense emotional trauma. The sad thing is, we honestly don't know how many men, for example, have been sexually abused. We say 1 in 4 women, we guess 1 in 7 men, but reality speaking, I think it's probably higher than that, because men have a harder time disclosing that. So when you think about the level of trauma that people have gone through and how they became dependent on a substance, it helped them survive the trauma initially. Unfortunately, it then destroys them. And so, again, those goodbye letters are very powerful, and it helps the person develop a coping skill, a coping pattern, and coping people to let go of that substance in. That's a lot about what treatment is about, healing some of those wounds. Next slide. I hope you can see this, but Harry Potter. I saw this recently, and actually let's go to the next slide. There's another picture of Harry Potter. And this was the mirror that he could look into, and whatever the person's deep-hearted longing for, they would see in that mirror. And so the story with Harry Potter is he lost his parents, and so he longs for a family. It's his desperate hole in the soul of Harry Potter, is to find a family. And in reality, this is kind of what people are doing with their addiction. They long for this desperate hole inside of them to be filled. And when they find a substance that does that, they fall into it in a destructive manner. Okay, I'm going to show you this little chart, and this is going to kind of capture some of what I'm talking about. Eventually, in a few minutes, we're going to be talking mostly about biology, but right now I want to acknowledge that for every person that becomes addicted, that crosses this line into addiction, there are genetic factors. And some people get a lot of genetics. We call that genetic loading. Some people have less. Then we have biological factors, and these are things like, does the person get good sleep and rest? Does the person have adequate nutrition? Does the person have another disease process happening inside of them? Are there biological things that are hanging on to this person. Then there's the psychological factors, and you can see each person gets different levels of these. The psychological factors are things we just talked about. Any kind of childhood trauma that the person went through, any kind of adult trauma often that the person went through that attaches a huge hole to them. And then social factors would be things like there are different times in our society that drinking and drugging is part of what it's about. It might be in your neighborhood. That's how people cope. It might be within your cultural group. That's how people cope. It might be because you're in college. We have lots of folks, not so much in our community college because we draw from a lot of students who are returning. But you think about the traditional 18-year-old who goes off to college, lives in the dorm. Drinking is part of that world. The military is another time. Drinking is part of that world. Using is part of that world. And so you have social times in your life where to belong is to use. And then finally, the actual drug and alcohol use. Now, this is going to move in a minute. This particular slide is going to change. And what I want you to do is to just look at person 2 right now. And would you move the slide? Just click it. Okay, so person 2 crossed the line into addiction. Can you go back one? Okay, and let's look at person 2 again. Go forward. Okay. Something happened to this person. We can make up a story about this person. Obviously, their genetics didn't change. Their biological factors didn't change, but what changed is they had some kind of psychological trauma. Maybe something happened for them that they had a death of a loved one. Maybe they were the driver in a car where someone got killed. Maybe they went to war and experienced severe traumas there. Maybe they went through a divorce that destroyed them emotionally. Lots of things could have happened. We also noticed that their social world shrunk, and whatever went on, their drug and alcohol use caused them to go over and cross that line on addiction. Okay, can you go back again? Okay, let's look at person 1 now. Person 1 is right there at the line of addiction. Okay, and look at what happens to person 1. In fact, they pulled away from that line. And we could again make up a story about why this happened. Perhaps this happened because, again, that person was driving in a car where someone got killed, and they quit using. They said, I'm not going to do this again. I had a fellow when I was working in the prisons who was at that line of addiction during his crime. He came to prison, and he often said how fortunate he was, which is an interesting thing to say. But he said that because the people who were still on the street, who didn't get convicted while he was incarcerated, at least one of those people died. And he said, I got the chance to get sober. I got the chance to have a new life. And the people who didn't get convicted were still out there using and obviously still had the opportunity to die. Okay, next slide. So that's how those all can interact, but right now for today I want to focus predominantly on the biology. Okay, so are we born to be addicted? Is that who we are? People are saying that personality and our temperament and sometimes even our choices show that there's a genetic component to that. So let's see what we say with addiction. People who have studied addiction their entire professional career in a research venue have come up with this idea that there's a genetic component and it interacts with the environment. So, for example, some of you might be in this room right now who everybody in your family was addicted. Your parents, your sisters, your brother, your uncle, your grandparents. And you somehow got into that same kind of route. In fact, some people's family histories, you know, you can't shake a family tree without having an alcoholic or an addict fallout. It's just rampant throughout the family. Other people, though, have situations where maybe that was their background and they chose not to drink. In fact, it's very interesting to note that people who are completely teetotalers, if you ask them, often have had a family experience that was just horrible because addiction was so rampant. So they made the choice not to drink. So that genetics is not, you're not doomed, okay? You're not doomed by genetics. It is the importance of interacting with the environment. That's why there's a tremendous amount of effort right now being made to reach kids before they start using. Because even if they have the genetics, that doesn't mean they're doomed to a life of addiction. It means that they're going to have a propensity to develop addiction if they use. But if there are ways that we can help them not use, that's going to save their life in many ways. Let's go on. This is an example that is done by a man named Carla Dvoracek, and he's simplifying it. Okay, he's simplifying it. In reality, there's somewhere between 89 to 100 genes that are connected with addiction. There isn't a single addiction gene. There's 89 to 100 different genetic pieces that would cause somebody to develop addiction. It might be for some people, they get a much greater high than the other person does. These two people go out to drink, one person drinks, loves the experience. The other person drinks, doesn't care for it much. So our experience with the substance itself, also how our bodies process substances can be somewhat genetic. And so that we can see that there are some cultural groups that really kind of shy away from substances, and there are some cultural groups that it seems to be part of their culture. Part of that can be genetic. Anyway, back to this slide. Carla Dvoracek, as I said, simplified it, and he's guessing, for the example, that there are 5 genes that are contributing to addiction. And mom happens to be carrying 4 of them, and dad happens to be carrying 1 of them. So when those eggs and sperm connect to make the children, you have, in this case, an example, 4 children, okay? One of those children can have no chance almost, if they use, of becoming addicted. Their propensity for addiction is so high because of the way the genetics fell out that they have very little safety if they are to drink. Another person, same mom and dad, just the way the genetics happen, might have not a very strong propensity towards addiction at all. And the other 2 can be somewhere in the middle. Think about in your own family if you have siblings. Some of you might have blue eyes, some of you might have brown eyes. Some of you might be tall, some of you might be short. Some of you might be blonde-haired, some of you brown, you might even throw a redhead in there. And how can that be if it's the same mom and dad? Well, it's the same thing with this. It's just how genetics work. So I think that's confusing for families sometimes because they'll say, well, I don't drink, I don't have a problem. How come he's falling down drinking? How come he's the one with the real issues? Same mom and dad, it can't be genetics. Well, yes, it can. It can have a huge impact, even with blood relatives. Okay. Next 3 slides show individuals who are prone to high-risk activities. Next one. Does it look fun to you or scary? Next one. Okay. So these are personality styles that seem to want to push the envelope, who seem to love that adrenaline high, who seem to need high amounts of stimulation. In contrast, there are people who get their kicks from sitting in nature and watching birds, okay? What makes the difference? There is some evidence to suggest that people who have a high need for stimulation, and they're going to do it by extreme activities and taking large risks, not only in jumping off buildings, but also in drug usage, have a genetic propensity towards addiction. that their levels of neurotransmitters in their brain are different than the person who's sitting in the woods watching birds and getting a real kick from that. So you might think about that in terms of the people you know, whether it's yourself or someone in your family. Was there an increased sense of boredom with this person? That they didn't seem to be able to enjoy life, they had to push life, they had to rev it up and challenge it and take it to the extremes. So that's what these pictures are about. Next slide. Okay. This, I think, is really, really, really important, and I don't think I understood this in the early years of my career. Addiction is almost completely an adolescent onset disease, an adolescent onset disease. And you can see here, about 15.4% every year use alcohol for the first time of youth, basically 12 to 20. So think about what's going on emotionally, socially, physically in an adolescent. It's becoming common knowledge that parts of our brain do not completely develop until we're 24 years old. That the frontal lobes, the judgment, the good sense does not develop till people are sometimes 24 years old. So when you're impacting a developing brain with toxic substances, you can understand that it might be helping how that brain forms. Okay. Also, 7.6% of youth use an illicit drug every year. Let's turn to the next slide. To put that in terms of numbers, in an average day in 2006, 7,970 people ages 12 to 17 used alcohol that day for the first time. That's a lot of people. That's almost 8,000 teens a day are using substances. 4,348 students ages 12 to 17 are using illicit drugs, and on and on and on. Next slide. Here's another way of putting it. Cigarettes are 1,245,240 people used in a year, ages 12 to 17. That's very terrifying. Next slide. Okay. This is also why prevention efforts are gearing towards legitimate ways to help people understand the dangers of addiction. If a person sees that there's a risk, the darker color on the slide is people perceive risk, okay? If they perceive risk, or they perceive that there's moderate, slight, or no risk, you can see that for the risk of having 5 or more drinks once or twice a week, for people who see that as risky behavior or have less usage than people who say, oh, it's no big deal. Same with the use of marijuana. People who see that as a dangerous thing are using much less than people who say, no big deal. Next slide. Okay. This, to me, knocks my socks off. We have found that 1 in 3 individuals who start drinking at age 17 or younger become dependent. If they're under 17 and they start drinking, 1 in 3 will become dependent. But if they wait until age 21, 1 in 10 will become dependent. That's pretty profound. And that's, again, going back to the idea that if we can help teens delay early use, we're giving them a much better shot at life. Not only in terms of learning coping skills and learning other ways to be in the world rather than drinking and drugging, but we're also saving their brain from the bombardment of chemicals at a developing stage. Next page. Okay. And this is what I was referring to a minute ago. Normal neurological development says that our brains do not fully develop, that some of our judgment and our inhibition, our ability to say no, develops much later. It comes online later. And this is why the adolescent brain will respond to drugs and alcohol much differently. They have a greater sense of reward from usage and a smaller sense of consequences from usage. Okay? This is also pretty powerful, thinking about youth who are depressed. We don't really talk a lot about that, but the rate of depression in our young people in our culture is unfortunately very high. And so for people who are depressed, 29.2% of those with major depression initiated alcohol versus 14.5%. So in other words, if you're depressed, you're much more likely to go towards alcohol by almost 2%, or double. And the same is true when you look at the stats around illicit drug use. Of those who used illicit drugs, 16.1% of those had a major depressive episode, with others who are 6.9%. So I think that's very powerful. Okay, so why do people use drugs? They use drugs because they work. They work reliably. They work consistently. You know what's going to happen when you use. And so people, you hear it in recovery meetings all the time, many people stop growing emotionally once they start using substances, because you don't have to learn how to cope. You can go to that substance and it will work. And again, going back to our discussion a few minutes ago, when you've had a very traumatic life and you have had no healthy adults in your life to help you learn those coping skills, again, you're going to turn to substances because they work. Okay. So how do they work in the brain? Okay, here we go. Do you remember hearing that word instinct? It's a dog's instinct to kind of turn around several times before they lay down. That's an instinctual behavior. Well, human beings have instinctual behaviors too. We just don't think about it that way. And the new term is called drive states. Instead of instinct, it's called drive states. Here's what we know. We know that people will seek and obtain food, seek and obtain sex, seek and obtain water, seek and obtain shelter, and protect their young under whatever conditions you get in. This is because it's instinctual for us to do that. It causes our species to continue to live. If we didn't protect our young, we wouldn't have a species, right? If we didn't get food and water and shelter and have sex, we wouldn't have either our own bodies surviving or our species surviving. It's bred into us to do these things. And so when you think about that, most of us have never, I wouldn't say most of us, actually some in this room have had this experience, where you haven't had food and water and shelter, and you've needed to have that at all costs. And you would do whatever you have to do to get those needs met. You know, sexual drive is minimized. We're so distorted with sex in our society. We kind of foster addiction with sex. We don't understand healthy sexual relationships. But there is a strong instinctual drive to be sexual. It's important. It's part of who we are as human beings because, again, that's how we have more people, okay? And protecting our young. You have heard the stories, I've certainly heard them, where this little 100-pound woman can run out, lift a car up because her child's caught underneath it. Now, how does she do that? It's that release of neurotransmitters and hormones in her body that will cause her to put her own life in jeopardy to save that of her child. Most parents, if they're not affected with chemicals in their brain, would easily give up their own life to save their child's life. They would jump in front of the bullet if it's coming that way. And that's instinct. That's bred into us. Okay, one of the things that you think about and we can flip back to that list again, is that when we perform behaviors that are instinctual, that help us survive, we get rewarded with this surge of pleasure. And why would we do that? Well, it makes complete sense. You're going to want to repeat things that are going to be pleasurable. And so in our development as a species, all those instinctual drives were rewarded with pleasure, a jolt of basically dopamine and other neurochemicals, so that when something wonderful happens, you have a nice meal, you drink, you have a good shelter, you have a wonderful sexual relationship, you have beautiful children, you're feeling pleasure from those experiences so that you'll repeat them, and it will be an ongoing relationship. This is so important to know because drug usage hijacks this pleasure mechanism. We all know people who are addicted. Maybe it was yourself. That you quit taking care of yourself, you quit taking care of your children, you quit eating, you quit drinking, you even quit having any kind of sexual relationship because the drug was the most important. It was the only thing that mattered. Next slide. Okay. So this is basically a summary of what I just said, when you do your drive, whatever it is, seeking shelter, eating, drinking, you get a reward, which you experience as euphoria. And if the drive is not met, you get dysphoria, anxiety, irritability, and sometimes anger. Okay? So this is a pleasure scale. And you think about in your life. Let's kind of do it this way. Erase this board here a minute. Let's see, today's April 12th, okay? So you wake up April 12th, and you had a miserable night of sleep. And so here's normal, okay? You had a lousy night of sleep. So you wake up actually kind of below normal. You're fatigued, life is not looking so good, you have to kind of emotionally kick yourself to even get out of bed, so you're feeling crummy. And then you get that first cup of coffee, and you're kind of moving towards normal, okay? And you're, okay, I can make it, I'll survive. And then, in fact, you go to school and you find out that your best friend is going to be able to meet you for lunch. And you're feeling actually pretty good about that, okay? But then you go to class, and doggone it, it's a lecture, and it's kind of boring, and you're sitting there, and you're going, oh, you know, I wish this time had passed. What time is it? And so you move back down there, and you kind of go around like this throughout the day, right? Good news, bad news, good news, bad news. And you're mostly circling around a normal experience with life. Okay. So it is rare, but it does happen that you get to euphoria. Okay, let's talk about in a natural way. When does somebody get to euphoria? Do you remember falling in love? Oh, isn't that euphoric? It is the most wonderful thing, the way that person just talks and walks and smells, and oh, your heart's just beating and your palms get sweaty, and then they kiss you and you think you're going to die. You're so happy, it's so blissful, it's so wonderful. I hope you've all had that experience, okay? I know he has. Okay, so that's euphoria. Falling in love is euphoric. But you know what? It doesn't last forever. You do end up kind of coming down from that high and kind of coming to a more stable, normal kind of experience. There are other events that cause people to go to euphoria. Things like, for some of you, can you imagine graduation day, walking across that platform and getting that diploma, and everybody's clapping for you, and you're thinking, wow, I really did it. I couldn't believe I could, and now I did it. And I'm so excited, and I've got the cap and gown on, I've got the diploma, my family's there, everybody's cheering me on. It's just a wonderful accomplishment. Soon in this city, we're going to have people who are going to feel euphoria because they've done Bloomsday. And they trained, and they worked at it. And maybe they've done smaller races. But they're going up that doomsday hill, and they're thinking, am I going to make it? Am I going to make it? And then they finally cross that finish line, and it's like, yes, I just did this great race. People in Coeur d'Alene who do the Ironman, can you imagine the euphoria they feel after that? Sometimes people, you feel euphoria at the birth of a child. particularly if they have struggled to have children, and then finally they have this child, and they hold this infant in their arms, and their heart is literally melting, and their tears are coming down their face. It's like, oh my God, I've got a baby. This baby is part of me. What a profound experience. So we're meant in our neurochemical, central nervous system, body, we're meant to feel euphoria. It's supposed to happen. It's just not supposed to happen very often. In fact, Ernest Hemingway said, in terms of sexual experience, the earth moves 4 times. In other words, you're going to have such great sex 4 times in your life that it will feel like the earth is moving. And I always say, just make sure you're not having sex in an earthquake, because then you lose one of your 4 times. But so anyway, we can have incredible life experiences that change our life, and it's euphoria. We can also have experiences at the other end. We can have things happen that are so terrible, so awful, that we can't even imagine. Imagine being in Haiti during the experiences that were happening down there, or some of the tragedies that we've heard about across the world and in our own country, when everything you've had and known and loved, including not only possessions, but the people, are gone. And it's devastating, and you have nothing to build up from. That's true dysphoria. That's when life does not look good at all. But most of us are circling here. And we're trying to reach a state called homeostasis. Homeostasis is balance, okay? Think about a teeter-totter, you know? We go up, we go down, we go up, we go down, we go up, we go down, and every once in a while you can get it, if you and your partner on the other end of the teeter-totter are about the same weight, you can get it where you're kind of in the middle there. But we tend to go up and down and up and down. We're striving constantly for homeostasis, and our bodies are set up to help us reach homeostasis. Okay, next slide. What I'm going to talk about is what happens with addiction, and this slide will show it. And you're going to need to click multiple times, but I'll go like this each time to click. So let's say that you have an okay life. It's kind of a normal life, no big deal. And somehow you get introduced to a drug like meth or cocaine. Go ahead and click. Holy smokes, you can't imagine that you could feel that good. In fact, you are overwhelmed with euphoria, and you didn't have to do anything to get there. All you had to do was take this drug, and your whole body is tingling. It's, people have described it, you know, if a great sexual experience, if you were to chart it, is from the floor to about here, using some of those high potency stimulant drugs makes your sense of pleasure up beyond the roof of this building. So it's better than sex. It's better than anything you can imagine. It's great euphoria. You're at the absolute top. It's fabulous. Okay, and then you don't use, and you kind of have a little bit of fatigue from using, and so you kind of a little bit below normal, but you use again. Go ahead. And there you go. You're maybe not at the same level of high, but you are feeling pretty good. And you come back down, and you go back up, and you come back down, and you go back up. Now this time, after some period of using, you're noticing something's happening. You're not getting as high anymore. And in fact, when you go back down, you're crashing lower than you were before. So you keep going. You try and use again, and again, and again, and again, and again. What's happening? This person's body and brain are adapting to the chemical. This is tolerance, and this is dependence, okay? You're not getting anywhere near euphoria now, okay? And you keep going. Do about 4 more. Okay, now you're using just to feel normal. You're using because when you don't use, you feel so bad. You feel so bad physically, you feel so bad emotionally, you feel so bad spiritually. You hate it when you're not using, and you have to use just to feel normal. Keep going. Keep going. Now you're using, and 1 more. you're not even getting to normal. You have severely impacted your brain and body. And you're using just to cope, just to live now at this point. There's no normal about it. There's no euphoria about it. It's just survival. Okay, and I think you're almost at the end. Click till you're at the end here. Yeah. Basically what happens for people is they move from, hey, I like what these drugs do, I want these drugs, I need these drugs, I require these drugs. And as you progress along this, you have an increasing loss of control over your usage, and this is very powerful, an increasing sense of boredom when you're not using. Even if you're not in that horrible dysphoria, you're at least bored. You're at least, I need something here. Okay, one more. Okay, so what do drugs do? In a real simple way, what we've been kind of summarizing here is that drugs modify and change your sense of pleasure. Let's go back and review. We have drive states. They're in our brain. They cause us to do instinctual behaviors. When we do those behaviors, we're reinforced to do those behaviors because we get pleasure from them, okay? But when we use drugs, we don't even need to use those behaviors anymore. We can just get high with just the drug. We don't have to have messy relationships and struggle to find shelter and food and clothing and all those things. We can just take our drugs. And what they do, this is the point right here, when drugs are used, the release of pleasure chemicals in your brain is much greater than when we respond to instinctual drives. So why wouldn't we use drugs? It's easier. We get a better feeling from it, initially at least. Okay, next slide. Basically, this becomes the great brain robbery. Next one. Okay, and the word for this is called neuroadaptation. Basically what this means, this is a quote from someone, and it says, cocaine just tells you do more. With crack, there's no such thing as no. There really isn't. You can't go, hey, no thanks, I don't do drugs. It's not like that, not with cocaine. If it's there, your body jumps and your mind follows later. That's what the drug does. It tells you to do more. Okay? So where is this happening? When you get to physiological actions, we'll talk a lot more about this. I'm not expecting you to remember this. I just want to introduce the concept that if you were to put your finger here and your finger here and imagine those two lines intersecting in your brain, that's where this is, okay? It's deep in the center of your brain, and this little pathway, this circuit, is called the medial forebrain bundle. You don't have to remember that for now, but it is where in your brain drugs are doing their impact. It is where in your brain these chemicals are being released in massive quantities to cause you to have the high. And that as your brain adapts to those chemicals being there, if you take them away, you have a backlash. Just to kind of recap again, this part of your brain where those two parts intersect, those two lines represented by my fingers intersect, is where addiction really happens. It is a brain disease. Let's go on. I don't care that you remember this. It has no relevance for you right now. It's just the names of the various circuit parts in your brain. So I'm not even going to say the words because it's going to just overwhelm you. So just know that there are lots of parts to that medial forebrain bundle. What I do want you to at least have a beginning understanding of is that there are neurotransmitters that are in your brain, lots and lots and lots of neurotransmitters, maybe hundreds. But there are certainly ones that are impacted very strongly by substances. And you notice that there's one there that's highlighted the most, dopamine. Dopamine is, as I said a little bit ago, the pleasure chemical in your brain. So when you do instinctual drives or you take drugs, many different neurotransmitters can be impacted, but almost always dopamine is impacted. Go ahead. And we talked about neuroadaptation. That's the process by which your brain receptors adapt to these high levels of neurotransmitters. They can then become insensitive to normal neurotransmitter levels. I want to tell a little quick story here. I used to work with child protective service workers all the time. And I was trying to teach them and train them about why addicted parents don't care for their children. So I want you to imagine a little scenario. You're a healthy parent, your brain's working well, your little child runs up to you and says, "Mommy, Mommy, I love you." Well, your heart's melting, you pick that child up and give them lots of kisses, okay? That's with a healthy kind of parenting sort of thing. With a brain that has been so severely impacted, that little child runs up to you, "Mommy, Mommy, I love you," you don't feel anything. You're flat. Or if you're in withdrawal, you're wanting your drug. So the child that used to be a source of pleasure now is an irritation. And what you really need is that drug. And you need that drug so much so that you're willing to go to extreme costs to get it. Anything it takes to get that drug. And it's a brain disorder. We'll keep talking about that. Go ahead. I like to think of it as a brain injury. I have a woman I know who was 1 year older than I was in grade school and was a pretty good friend. She got into a very serious car accident, and she had a brain injury. And today, she has a developmental level of maybe 12 and she was a brilliant girl. But her head got impacted in the car accident. She had a serious brain injury. It makes sense that she acts the way she does. We understand that. What we don't understand is addiction is also a brain injury. The behavior that we see in individuals, with the behavior we see in that parent who could not respond to that child, is because of a brain injury. Now, people say, well, so what? They did it to themselves. Yes, on a sense, that's true. But also, if you start to look at all the environmental factors and genetic predisposition and the lack of adequate coping skills and this one substance helped me survive, you can understand why people will administer a substance that ultimately injures their brain. What we know is that how old you are when you first start using, the intensity of the drug that you use, and the length of time that you use that drug is going to impact how that brain is altered. And how difficult then it's going to be to have that change around and to have the brain normalized to a healthy level. Basically what we talk about, go ahead, is that it's almost 2 years before we really know what the wreckage has been in a brain. This is just an interesting idea about genetics again. There really isn't a light switch in your brain, of course, okay? But there is a part of a person's brain that says, I've had enough. You know, I just went and got some water at break. I can drink water to quench my thirst, and at some point I'll say, okay, that's enough, and I'll just let the water sit. But if the switch in my brain that says that's enough wasn't working right, I would drink and drink and drink and drink and drink and drink this water till I would do damage to my body. But my brain works right. It says it's enough. Well, for some people, again, genetically predisposed, it's like that switch that said that's enough is gone. It's not working right. And you'll have people who, when everyone else stops, just keeps going and going and going. So it's a brain malfunction. Okay. When we have withdrawal, it's back to our homeostasis idea here. When you go up, what do you got to do? Come down. Okay. There's a backlash. So we all know the stories. You might have lived the story where somebody who's using stimulant drugs and they're up and they're up and they're up and they're up and they're up, at some point crash. And that crash you can't wake them from. They're so profoundly depressed, if you want to use that word. Depressed in terms of body function. Their body isn't functioning anymore. They crash. The same is true for somebody who's using a depressant drug like alcohol extensively. They're late-stage, long-term alcoholic. You stop the alcohol, and what's going to happen? They go into DTs, hallucinations, severe withdrawal, death. It's also true when you think about a heroin addict who's using, or in this case, we have so many prescription narcotic addicts at this point. They're using and they're depressing their system. They quit using, they go into withdrawal, which is really agitation. They can't sleep. Kicking the habit that term came from the kicking, the nervous system reacting. So if you depress a person, the backlash is agitation. If you're agitating a person, the backlash is severe depression. And this is going back to how long does it take to normalize again, to allow the system to get into homeostasis? 4 weeks to 2 years, okay? It's not unusual. In fact, it is the common experience for people in early recovery to not be able to sleep, to not be able to function sexually, to not be able to think clearly, to have strong emotional responses to things. In AA, they call it making mountains out of molehills. You just have this crazy nervous system now that's trying to find its space and its balance. And that can go on for a very, very long time. So here's somebody talking about a quote. This is an 18-year-old recovering person. When I ran out, it was severe. I mean body convulsions, long memory lapses, cramps that were just enough, well, you couldn't stand them. And it lasted for about 5 days, the actual convulsions, the cramps, the pain and stuff. And then it took another couple of weeks before I felt anywhere near normal. Now that's an 18-year-old. What about somebody who's 50 or 40 or 30? Okay? So what we talk about is something, and you'll hear more about this as you go through your program, but just to introduce it, post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Pause. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Post-acute means this is what's going on after the person has already had the basic initial withdrawal. This is after. Post means after the initial, the acute withdrawal. And you have folks, many of you have lived this, where you lack concentration, you're depressed, you have drug craving, you lack energy, loss of appetite, your body and your brain are just not well. Okay, we've talked, and you've heard this phrase before, addiction is not an event, it is a process. And that's absolutely true. The addicted person gradually loses more and more and more control of their life. They have a defensive system called denial that says it's not that bad. And when confronted, there's a lot of blaming, minimizing, anger, rationalizing, and it becomes a very chronic, and we know, fatal pattern. This again is going back to that whole idea of why does somebody go into post-acute withdrawal? If somebody has had a normal brain, and they take a level of what's the normal amount of dopamine in that person's brain, it's quite high. Somebody who is chronically ill with addiction has a lower functioning level of available dopamine. And this is just one neurotransmitter. This is happening with all of them. Okay, I wanted to talk about Dr. Daniel Amen. Okay, he is a man who does these incredible slides of people's brains. He's certainly done them for addicted brains. He's done them for violent criminals. He's done them for people with ADHD or ADD. He's done them for people of every kind of walk of life. And what he's done is take a picture of a brain that shows the glucose being used in the brain. In other words, you have to understand this. There are not holes in a person's brain who's used cocaine for 2 years. If that person were to die and they were to open the skull up and look at the brain, there would not be holes in the brain. What these holes represent is that there isn't blood flow going there. And so that part of the brain is essentially asleep. It's not working, okay? So in a healthy brain, you have a nice, pretty picture of a beautiful brain. In somebody who's using substances, you're going to see what I'm talking about when I say the brain is injured. Parts of the brain are not functioning. Let's look at some more. Here's alcohol abuse and heroin use. These are, again, spec images. I don't want anybody leaving this classroom and say, oh my gosh, he showed us pictures and heroin eats holes in your brain. It does not do that. okay? But it puts to sleep parts of your brain that do not function in a normal way. Consequently, you make horrible decisions, you live your life in a very unhealthy way, and you are injured. Your brain is injured, much like my friend who was in the car accident, much like somebody with a serious mental illness. We know that somebody has a serious mental illness, we say, well, they have a brain imbalance. Things aren't working right for them. That's also true with addiction. And if we can get that concept that the brain is injured, it helps us get away from the stigma that associates with so many people who are in recovery. One more. Okay, and here's marijuana. Parts of the brain asleep. Okay. So, if we can get that concept that somebody has a brain injury, and as they are healing from this injury, they're irresponsible, selfish, aggressive, grandiose, depressed, lack concentration, can't respond emotionally appropriately, it's because their brain is messed up. And again, doesn't it make sense when I said earlier on in this lecture, addiction is predominantly an adolescent disease. It starts in adolescence when the brain is developing. So when you think about recovery, and if any of you are in recovery, you should be so thankful if you can get up in the morning, get to school, read your textbooks, struggle with understanding them, but keep at it. Because you, for whatever reason, had some kind of miraculous recovery in your brain that you can do that. Some people can never get there. So it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be able to heal. Okay, so basically what we're saying is that addicting drugs match a neurotransmitter that you have in your brain. And it causes that brain to have an injury by altering what's maybe naturally there. So let's go back to dopamine. If you start out with two people and from the table up to my hands they have this much dopamine, the person who starts using is altering their brain function so that they have very little dopamine that's actually working. Isn't it also possible that some people are born that way, that they never feel right? And their neurotransmitter levels are off. And then they find a substance and they feel normal for the first time. Wouldn't that cause them to want to reuse and reuse and reuse? Because they're, in their own way, they're playing physician and normalizing their brain to feel like they're normal. This last little point I want to quickly touch on. Cognitive behavioral therapies change brain chemistry. Now you might not know what that means, so I'm going to take a minute to talk about it. Imagine that you had a very dear friend in grade school. I mean, you guys were in each other's houses all the time, you rode your bicycles, you went trick-or-treating, you were just real close, real close. And then life happens and you go your separate ways, and then you get this phone call, and this buddy that you haven't seen in, what, 20 years is in town and has found you somehow. And you arrange to get together. And you walk in and it's kind of like the movie, right? You see each other and it's like, oh, fabulous, I'm so happy to see you. And then you go out and you have a cup of coffee or lunch and you start saying, remember that time that we stole that Mr. Jones's carrots out of his garden and we had such a good time? And do you think your brain chemistry has been changed by that experience? You bet. You bet. You've pumped up those feel-good neurotransmitters. You're having a wonderful experience. Okay. Now imagine this scene. You have lived a life of addiction, and you have done great harm to not only yourself, but to many other people. And you get into recovery, and in recovery, you start talking about that. And you start letting go of some of the pain and grief and remorse that you have for how you've lived your life. And you have somebody that you're talking to that you have trust in, and you know that they're not there to judge you. They're there to support you and help you. And maybe you cry for the first time in 10 years. Do you think that's changed your brain chemistry? Absolutely. Do you think that if you were to appropriately so, and AA and NA have lots of guidelines around how to make amends, how to say you're sorry to the people you've harmed. If you actually have that opportunity to make amends to someone that you have harmed, do you think that changes your brain chemistry? Absolutely. How about prayer? How about music? How about physical exercise? How about any of those kinds of things that cause you to feel better afterwards? The reason you're feeling better afterwards is you're changing your brain chemistry. Healthy nutrition. You know, if you, for example, have low blood sugar and you're not being able to function, and all of a sudden you eat something that helps normalize your blood sugar, that's changed not only your blood sugar, but your brain chemistry. So thinking, how we think and how we behave changes our brain chemistry. And where addiction is going is learning how to best normalize these levels of neurotransmitters in our brain. Remember how I wrote abstinence enhancers on the board earlier on? We're looking at how can we help somebody not get back into that addictive cycle by helping them during this period of time when they're in recovery and they're having all this delayed withdrawal and moodiness and aggressiveness and you know, they're just not a balanced person. How can we help them feel more balanced? How can we help them stay sober by maybe balancing out some of these neurotransmitters? I didn't want to stop our lecture today without talking about relapse, because relapse is part of the definition of addiction. It's a relapse-prone disease. And so basically, for many people, total abstinence is very rare initially. Some people do. You know, they just stop one day and they're done. But most people move towards recovery, and they have these episodes of going back to initial use. Why do they do that? Because these intense emotional and physical triggers are everywhere. It can be a sound, it can be a smell, it can be a trip to the grocery store to buy a ham and you pass by the alcohol aisle. It can be going to a family reunion and you're all emotionally triggered and you don't know what to do with all of that. It can be because you're happy, it can be because you're sad, it can be because you haven't had enough sleep. It can be because of emotional reactions. You're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired can all cause relapse. And what we know is that relapse can be deadly. Some people never come back from relapse, unfortunately so. But relapse, we also have to help people who are getting into recovery understand that because you relapse doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means you've had a relapse episode and you get back in the game. Okay. I want to normalize relapse in terms of chronic diseases. Here we have drug addiction, and it says 40 to 60% of people with drug addiction relapse in their struggle to get sober. But you know what? 30 to 50% of diabetics also will have relapse episodes because they don't follow their plan perfectly. People with hypertension or asthma, these are chronic diseases, much like addiction, that have relapse rates as well. But for some reason, we have demonized the relapse in addiction. And we have said that's just terrible, that's awful. And of course, the consequences are very high. We know people go to jail, we know people die, we know people lose families because of relapse. But we also have to understand that other diseases that require massive lifestyle change also have relapse episodes that are part of what we expect. And basically, when people do their treatment, they don't relapse. It's when they get out of their treatment that they end up relapsing. Next slide. So these are cues and triggers and cravings that cause relapse. Something that's in the environment. We can talk about that as we just did. Anything that, you know, an individual can be somebody who you see that you used to use with, and all of a sudden you have that intense craving. Endogenous means comes from within, and this can be somebody who has an imbalance normally in their body anyway, or because of their use has caused this. So they have some kind of natural imbalance. Untreated depression, for example, would be an endogenous cause of craving, that somebody has not had their depression adequately treated, and so they're going to self-medicate. Stress. Stress seems to cause intense cravings for people. And it's whatever is happening biochemically when you're in a stress experience is just urging you to use again. It just highly, highly creates that. And then the withdrawal, if it's inadequately treated itself, you know, we used to believe, oh, let those addicts go through their withdrawal. It'll show them. They won't use again. But what we know is that withdrawal in and of itself can cause some brain damage. So we want to help people withdraw humanely, okay? And then any kind of mental illness. And this is one of the areas that we're getting to in our field, is really recognizing the dual nature of people with mental health disorders and addiction disorders. They go hand in glove. High, high rates of folks who have an addictive disorder also have a mental health disorder. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things to think about as you move towards being a CDP, a chemical dependency professional, is assuming that your client is going to be having cravings and is prone to relapse. And one of the ways that some people start out their sessions is they bring out this little chart and they say, okay, tell me where you are today on this relapse craving. Are you at 0? You have 0 desire to use? Or are you maybe at a 5 or a 6 where you're having urgent thoughts of using and you're having a real hard time staying in control? That might very well determine what that session's going to be about that day. That you're really going to work on helping that person live through those cravings. And so people can gauge themselves on this kind of a chart. And most of recovery is learning how to survive those intense relapse craving times. Okay. This will be our last slide, and then we're going to close up. But this is just saying that in our world of addiction, most people do not get the treatment that they need. Unfortunately, somewhere around 95% of people don't even feel they need treatment. And those who did feel they needed treatment did not make an effort. And those that felt they needed treatment and did make an effort is 1.1% of the population. That's profound. I know many of you who are in recovery sit around and say, I'm a walking miracle, and you are. You are a walking miracle. When you think of the vast number of folks in this society who have serious substance use disorders and who then finally get to the point that they make an effort to get to treatment, I mean, that's 1%, 1.1% of the population. That's a miracle. So remember back to our slide about the iceberg? Part of what we need to do is figure out ways to help people get into treatment, get adequate treatment, and then have a strong support network once they end treatment. Because the last message I want to leave you with today is that addiction is a treatable disorder. People every single day get well. I wish I had a chart up there to show you the number of people every single day that are entering recovery. It's profound. And there's nothing that is sadder than to think that people who are caught in this vicious cycle of addiction believe there's no hope. There is always hope. There's many roads to Rome. And so if somebody has attempted recovery in the past and weren't successful, that means that we need to try harder and better to help them in new ways. We need to continue to support research in our field so that many, many, many more people will get into recovery.